Winter rarely announces itself in medieval history, yet it is always present, pressing quietly against every human decision. It did not arrive with banners or declarations, but with shorter days, frozen soil, and a cold that seeped through walls, bones, and certainty itself. To live in the medieval world was to live in negotiation with winter, a season that demanded preparation long before it arrived and exacted punishment when that preparation failed. Kings, peasants, soldiers, and monks all felt its reach equally, though not its consequences. Understanding medieval history without winter is like reading a shadow without its source. It was the silent force shaping survival, power, and belief. For the medieval mind, winter was not merely a season but a condition of existence. It defined the calendar more decisively than any king or council. Harvests were measured not by abundance, but by whether they could endure the coming cold. Homes were built less for comfort than for endurance, their walls thick and their openings small, designed to trap heat rather than light. Clothing was layered, repaired, reused, and inherited, because warmth was wealth in fabric form. Even language reflected this reality, as hardship and cold became interchangeable ideas. Winter was expected, feared, and accepted as inevitable. Unlike modern societies buffered by infrastructure and reserves, medieval communities lived close to the edge of survival. A mild winter meant relief, a chance to recover, to rebuild stores and strength. A harsh winter meant hunger, illness, and death. There was little middle ground. Food preservation depended on salt, smoke, and timing, and all could fail. Once fields froze, growth stopped entirely, and the countryside fell silent except for wind and hunger. Winter did not need to attack directly. It weakens bodies slowly, making people vulnerable to disease and despair. Mortality rose not from spectacle, but from accumulation. War, too, bent under winter's authority. Campaigns were planned around seasons, not ambition alone. Frozen roads could become highways or traps, depending on snow and ice. Armies starved as easily as civilians when supply lines collapsed under cold weather. Horses died, weapons froze, and morale thinned with daylight. Some battles were won not through strategy, but through endurance, as one side simply survived the winter better than the other. Winter rewarded patience and punished overreach. In this way, it shaped borders and thrones as decisively as any sword. Power in the medieval world was inseparable from insulation. Lords with stone halls, stocked cellars, and access to firewood endured winters that devastated their tenants. The poor felt cold as a constant presence, sleeping in shared spaces, burning what little they had, rationing food already insufficient. Winter exposed inequality without explanation or apology. It did not create injustice, but it revealed it brutally. Survival became a social measurement. Those who endured winter gained authority, credibility, and often divine legitimacy, while those who perished vanished quietly from record and memory. Religion offered meaning where explanation failed. Winter was interpreted as trial, warning, or punishment, depending on circumstance and belief. Sermons framed cold as a test of faith, famine as a reminder of humility. Processions and prayers sought relief from prolonged winters, while harsh seasons were woven into moral narratives about sin and correction. This framing did not reduce suffering, but it organized it, giving communities language to endure what could not be controlled. Winter thus shaped belief as much as belief shaped responses to winter. Faith and frost became inseparable companions. Emotionally, winter carved itself into the medieval psyche. Darkness arrived early and lingered, compressing days into narrow bands of labor and survival. Isolation increased as travel slowed and villages withdrew inward. Stories, songs, and rituals grew in importance, filling long nights with shared meaning. Fear coexisted with familiarity. Winter was dreaded, yet known intimately, like a recurring adversary that could not be escaped, only faced again. Over generations, this repetition shaped resilience, caution, and a deep awareness of human fragility against the natural world. Even innovation in the medieval era often responded quietly to winter. Improvements in housing, clothing, and food storage emerged not from inspiration, but necessity. Stone chimneys, better grain storage, communal ovens, and seasonal labor rhythms all reflected adaptation to cold. These changes were slow, uneven, and often invisible in historical records, yet they determined which communities endured and which vanished. Progress was not triumphal. It was incremental survival. Winter remained dominant, but humans learned to negotiate rather than merely endure its presence. To understand the medieval world is to see winter not as background, but as structure. It shaped economies by limiting growth, politics by restricting movement, and culture by enforcing humility. It taught societies to plan, fear, hope, and remember. Every spring carried relief precisely because winter had come before it, and every autumn carried dread because winter would return. The medieval era unfolded beneath this rhythm, steady and unforgiving. Winter did not rule through spectacle, but through persistence, quietly shaping history with every frozen breath. The medieval world existed within a climate that was neither stable nor fully understood, yet it was deeply familiar to those who lived inside it. Seasons were not abstract divisions of the year but lived realities that governed when people worked, traveled, married, fought, and prayed. Across much of medieval Europe, winters were long, dark, and frequently severe, while summers were brief windows of urgency in which survival for the entire year had to be secured. Spring and autumn were transitional and unpredictable, capable of rescuing or ruining a community with equal ease. This climatic rhythm shaped expectations so thoroughly that time itself was experienced less as a sequence of dates and more as a cycle of risk and opportunity tied directly to the weather. The Middle Ages coincided with significant climatic fluctuations. Most notably, the medieval warm period followed later by gradual cooling that would culminate in the Little Ice Age. These shifts were not perceived as global trends but as local patterns remembered through experience and oral memory. One generation recalled mild winters and reliable harvests, while the next endured colder seasons and repeated scarcity. Without instruments or long-term data, people understood climate through comparison and storytelling. A winter was judged harsh not by temperature, but by whether livestock survived, whether rivers froze solid, and whether stores lasted until spring. Climate was measured in consequences, not numbers. Geography intensified these differences. Northern Europe faced longer winters and shorter growing seasons, forcing communities to rely heavily on grain storage and animal husbandry. In mountainous regions, snow could isolate villages for months, turning distance into danger. Southern Europe experienced milder winters but harsher summers, where drought could be as deadly as cold. Coastal areas were shaped by storms and damp winds, while inland regions suffered from deep freezes. Medieval people did not speak of climate zones, yet they understood their land intimately, adapting farming methods, architecture, and diets to local conditions passed down through generations. Agriculture sat at the center of this climatic awareness. Planting and harvesting followed not calendars, but signs in nature: the thaw of soil, the return of birds, the lengthening of days. A late frost could destroy young crops, while excessive rain could rot grain before it reached storage. These risks were accepted as part of life, but never ignored. Farmers watched skies and winds with trained attention, drawing meaning from cloud patterns and animal behavior. This observational knowledge, though unsystematic, was sophisticated in its own way, rooted in survival rather than explanation. Without scientific frameworks, medieval societies filled gaps in understanding with belief. Weather was interpreted as a language through which divine will was expressed. A productive season suggested favor, while prolonged cold or unseasonable storms implied correction or warning. This belief shaped emotional responses to climate. People did not ask why winters were cold, but what they signified. Fasting, prayer, and processions emerged as tools for negotiating with forces beyond human control. Climate was not external to moral life. It was intertwined with it, reinforcing a worldview where nature and faith operated as one system. Daily routines reflected this acceptance of limitation. Work slowed in winter not out of choice, but necessity. Fields lay dormant, roads deteriorated, and daylight shortened the hours available for labor. Indoor tasks replaced outdoor ones, and communities turned inward. Expectations were modest, shaped by the understanding that productivity had boundaries imposed by the season. This restraint extended to ambition. Large projects were timed around favorable weather, and failure to respect climate was seen as arrogance rather than miscalculation. Patience became a cultural value reinforced by environmental reality. Travel offered another lesson in climatic humility. Journeys were planned around seasons, with winter movement avoided whenever possible. Snow, ice, and flooding turned familiar paths into hazards. Messengers delayed, markets shrank, and political authority weakened at distances it could not physically reach. This seasonal contraction of space shaped governance itself. Power was strongest when roads were passable and weakest when winter closed them. Climate thus influenced not only livelihoods, but the reach and reliability of medieval rule. Even memories were shaped by the weather. Chroniclers recorded years by notable seasons, describing winters so cold that wine froze in barrels or summers so wet that grain sprouted in the fields. These accounts were not scientific records but cultural markers, anchoring history to environmental experience. Climate entered narrative as a character rather than a condition, remembered for its effects on human affairs. In this way, weather became history, inseparable from the events it shaped. Living within the medieval climate required acceptance rather than control. People adapted through habit, belief, and careful observation, building lives around patterns they could not change. The limits imposed by long winters and short growing seasons fostered caution, resilience, and an acute awareness of dependency on forces beyond human authority. Climate did not merely surround medieval life. It structured it, setting boundaries within which societies learned to endure, interpret, and persist. Food in the medieval world was never abundant by default. It was earned through months of labor, careful timing, and favorable weather, then guarded closely against spoilage, theft, and misfortune. Winter stood as the final judge of whether that labor had been enough. Once the last harvest was gathered and the fields fell silent, communities entered a season where no new food could be produced. Survival depended entirely on what had already been secured. A single failure in this chain, a ruined crop, a spoiled store, a delayed harvest, could turn winter from a challenge into a catastrophe. Agriculture operated on a narrow margin. Medieval farming relied on simple tools, animal strength, and predictable seasonal rhythms. Yields were modest even in good years, leaving little surplus beyond what was needed to endure until the next harvest. Winter disrupted this balance by halting all growth and forcing reliance on stored grain, dried meat, salted fish, and preserved vegetables. These stores were vulnerable. Damp conditions caused rot. Rodents invaded barns and cellars. Salt, essential for preservation, was expensive and unevenly available. When winter stretched longer than expected, reserves dwindled faster than planned, and hunger crept in quietly. A harsh winter rarely acted alone. It often followed a poor harvest caused by late frosts, excessive rain, or summer drought. In such cases, communities entered winter already weakened. Grain bins were half full, livestock numbers reduced, and choices were made early about who would eat well and who would not. Families diluted bread with fillers, reduced portions, and slaughtered animals meant for breeding. These decisions carried long-term consequences. Killing livestock provided short-term relief but undermined future productivity, ensuring that the damage of one winter would echo into the next year. Storage itself was a fragile science. Grain had to be dried properly, kept away from moisture, and protected from pests. Underground pits, wooden granaries, and stone cellars each carried risks. A single leak or infestation could destroy months of work. Once winter set in, correcting such failures was impossible. Spoiled food could not be replaced, only endured. The psychological weight of opening storage spaces and finding them compromised added despair to hunger. Winter hunger was not sudden, it was a slow realization that supplies would not last. Distribution compounded these problems. Medieval food systems were local and seasonal. Markets shrank in winter as travel became difficult and surplus scarce. Roads deteriorated, rivers froze or flooded, and carts could not move freely. Communities that relied on trade or regional exchange found themselves isolated. Even towns, often better supplied than villages, faced shortages when surrounding countryside could not deliver grain. Prices rose sharply, placing food beyond the reach of the poor. Hunger thus followed lines of inequality, deepening divisions within already strained societies. Malnutrition weakened bodies long before starvation arrived. Diets narrowed to bread and thin gruel, lacking protein and essential nutrients. Children and the elderly suffered first, their resilience limited. Laborers lost strength, reducing their ability to work even when conditions allowed. Illness spreads more easily among underfed populations, turning hunger into disease. Winter mortality increased not only from cold, but from the cumulative effect of months of insufficient nourishment. Hunger rarely killed dramatically, it eroded life quietly. Social strain emerged as resources tightened. Communities accustomed to shared survival faced hard choices. Charity diminished as everyone felt the pressure. Theft increased, not from malice but necessity. Authorities responded with punishment, attempting to preserve order even as desperation grew. Trust frayed. A poor winter could turn neighbors into rivals, each guarding what little they had left. These tensions did not disappear with spring. They lingered, reshaping relationships and memories within communities. Famine represented the extreme end of this seasonal fragility. It was not a single event but a process, beginning with crop failure and ending months later in widespread death. Winter acted as the catalyst that transformed scarcity into disaster. Frozen ground prevented late planting. Snow delayed foraging and hunting. Livestock succumbed to cold or lack of fodder. By the time famine was fully recognized, it was already irreversible. Relief, when it came at all, arrived too late for many. Memory preserved these winters with particular clarity. Chronicles recorded years when bread vanished, when people ate bark or roots, when entire villages emptied. These accounts were not abstract statistics but lived trauma. Survivors measured time by such winters, marking their lives by before and after. Even generations later, stories of hunger shaped caution and fear, influencing how communities prepared for future winters. Excess was never trusted, because memory insisted it could vanish. Winter revealed the fragility beneath medieval food systems. It showed how survival depended not on abundance, but on balance, timing, and cooperation. A single harsh season could erase years of careful work, unraveling the thin security that separated stability from collapse. Hunger was not merely a lack of food, it was a force that reshaped bodies, relationships, and societies. In the medieval world, winter did not need to destroy fields to cause famine. It only needed to last long enough. Winter in the medieval world did not bring disease into existence, but it created the conditions in which illness thrived. The cold itself was rarely seen as the killer. Instead, it was understood as a weakening force, one that drained strength, slowed recovery, and left the body exposed to threats it might otherwise resist. As temperatures dropped and days shortened, people retreated indoors, sharing air, space, and breath in close quarters. What began as protection from the cold quietly became an invitation for sickness to spread. Winter turned ordinary ailments into deadly ones by exhausting the body's ability to endure them. The medieval understanding of illness rested on balance. Health was believed to depend on the proper alignment of bodily humors, influenced by diet, environment, and behavior. Cold was thought to thicken fluids, slow circulation, and suppress vital warmth. While these explanations were rooted in belief rather than biology, they reflected careful observation. People noticed that coughs lingered longer in winter, wounds healed more slowly, and fevers struck harder when the cold set in. Winter was associated with weakness not because it caused disease directly, but because it altered the body's resilience. Respiratory illness flourished in this environment. Smoke-filled homes, built to retain heat, trapped air thick with soot and moisture. Fires burned constantly, yet ventilation was limited, especially among the poor. Coughs echoed through shared rooms where families, servants, and animals slept together for warmth. In such conditions, colds, influenza-like illnesses, and pneumonia spread easily. What might have been a manageable sickness in summer often became fatal in winter, particularly for children and the elderly. Breath itself became laborious, strained by cold air and weakened lungs. Hunger deepened this vulnerability. As winter advanced and food stores diminished, diets grew thinner and less varied. Bread replaced vegetables, meat became rare, and protein intake dropped sharply. Malnutrition did not need to be severe to have consequences. Even modest deficiencies reduced the body's ability to fight infection. Wounds became infected, fevers lasted longer, and recovery slowed. Hunger and illness fed each other, forming a cycle that winter sustained. A sick body required nourishment to heal, yet illness reduced appetite and strength, accelerating decline. The concentration of people indoors intensified these effects. Winter confined communities physically and socially. Work slowed, travel ceased, and daily life compressed into enclosed spaces. Monasteries, homes, and workshops became crowded environments where illness moved invisibly from person to person. Quarantine as a concept barely existed, and separation was often impossible. Care for the sick meant proximity, not isolation. Families shared beds, clothing, and utensils. Compassion carried risk, but there was no alternative. In winter, illness became communal. Sanitation further deteriorated as cold limited water access and waste removal. Frozen ground made burial difficult and latrines unusable. Refuse accumulated closer to living spaces, contaminating air and water. Cleanliness, already challenging in medieval towns, became harder to maintain. These conditions did not create new diseases, but they magnified existing ones. Dysentery, fevers, and infections spread more easily when hygiene declined, and winter ensured that decline was widespread and prolonged. Medical responses were limited and shaped by the same seasonal constraints. Physicians and healers worked within humoral theory, prescribing warming foods, bloodletting, or herbal remedies to restore balance. While some treatments offered comfort, few could counteract the structural causes of winter illness. Access to care was uneven, with the poor relying on household remedies or charity. Even monasteries and hospitals struggled as resources thinned and caretakers themselves fell ill. Winter stretched medical capacity to its limits, exposing how fragile it truly was. Mortality statistics were rarely recorded systematically, but patterns were unmistakable. Chronicles and parish records noted increased deaths in winter months, particularly following poor harvests. Graves multiplied when cold coincided with hunger. Epidemics did not always erupt dramatically. Instead, death rates rose quietly, steadily, as weakened bodies succumbed one by one. Winter deaths were often unremarkable individually, yet devastating collectively. Entire age groups could be thinned without a single identifiable cause, leaving absence where life had been. The psychological weight of winter illness added another layer of suffering. Fear accompanied every cough and fever, especially when food was scarce and cold unrelenting. People recognized the signs of decline and knew how little could be done. This awareness fostered resignation as much as anxiety. Prayer became central, not only for healing, but for acceptance. Illness in winter was often framed as part of a larger ordeal, endured rather than cured. Survival felt provisional, dependent on forces beyond human command. Children bore a disproportionate share of this burden. Their smaller bodies lost heat quickly and required consistent nourishment that winter rarely provided. Infant and childhood mortality rose sharply during cold seasons, leaving lasting demographic scars. Families expected loss, yet never without grief. Each winter tested not only bodies, but the emotional endurance of communities accustomed to seeing life slip away quietly and frequently. Winter mortality remained higher than any other season because it aligned multiple vulnerabilities at once. Cold weakened bodies, hunger reduced defenses, confinement spread illness, and limited care slowed recovery. None of these factors acted alone. Together, they formed a system of attrition that winter sustained year after year. Disease did not need to arrive dramatically to be deadly. In the medieval world, winter itself prepared the ground, ensuring that when illness came, the body was already halfway defeated. War in the medieval world was never fought in isolation from the seasons. Strategy did not unfold on abstract maps, but across landscapes that changed character with the weather. Winter transformed familiar terrain into something unpredictable and often hostile, reshaping movement, timing, and ambition. Armies that marched confidently in summer found themselves stalled, scattered, or starving once the cold set in. The outcome of campaigns was frequently decided not by combat, but by whether forces could endure winter's demands. In this way, cold became an unspoken commander, dictating what was possible long before swords were drawn. Medieval warfare relied heavily on movement. Armies had to travel to fight, to forage, and to maintain communication with their rulers. Winter made all three increasingly difficult. Roads deteriorated under frost and snow, becoming impassable for carts and wagons. Rivers, essential for transport, froze unpredictably or flooded during sudden thaws. Bridges collapsed under ice, and ferries ceased operation entirely. What had been a manageable distance in summer could become an insurmountable barrier in winter. As movement slowed, momentum vanished, and with it the ability to sustain prolonged campaigns. Supply lines were the first casualties of cold. Medieval armies lived largely off the land, requisitioning food from surrounding countryside or relying on regular deliveries from nearby towns. Winter stripped the land bare. Fields lay dormant, villages had little surplus, and stored grain was guarded fiercely by civilians already anxious about survival. Foraging became both difficult and dangerous, provoking resistance and violence that further disrupted supply. Without reliable food, armies weakened quickly. Hunger undermined discipline, morale, and physical strength, turning soldiers into liabilities rather than assets. The cold itself eroded fighting capacity. Armor became heavier and more restrictive when layered over winter clothing. Metal stiffened and numbed hands, making weapons harder to grip. Frostbite and exposure claimed lives silently, often before any engagement occurred. Horses suffered alongside their riders, struggling to find fodder and shelter. A cavalry force without healthy mounts lost much of its effectiveness. Winter warfare demanded endurance rather than aggression, yet few armies were equipped for such conditions. Frozen terrain occasionally offered unexpected advantages, but these were rare and risky. Rivers that normally served as defensive barriers could become passable, allowing surprise crossings. Marshes hardened into temporary roads. However, ice was unreliable. A sudden thaw could trap forces mid-march, cutting off retreat and supply simultaneously. Commanders faced decisions with limited information, guided by experience rather than certainty. Misjudging winter terrain could doom an entire campaign without a single enemy encounter. Siege warfare, central to medieval conflict, was particularly vulnerable to winter. Maintaining a siege required steady supplies, manpower, and morale, all strained by cold. Attackers struggled to keep camps functional as snow accumulated and shelters failed. Disease spread rapidly among besieging forces confined to crowded encampments. Defenders, protected by walls and familiar surroundings, often endured winter better than attackers. Many sieges were abandoned once cold set in, not because objectives changed, but because winter made persistence impossible. Political calculations reflected this reality. Campaigns were planned with seasonal limits in mind, often beginning in spring and ending before winter. A ruler who ignored these rhythms risked disaster. Winter campaigning was sometimes attempted out of desperation or ambition, but rarely succeeded. More often, cold halted wars temporarily, imposing a seasonal pause that shaped negotiations and truces. Power ebbed and flowed with accessibility. Authority weakened when armies could not move to enforce it, allowing rebellions to survive simply by enduring winter behind impassable terrain. Travel beyond warfare followed similar constraints. Messengers delayed or failed to arrive, fracturing communication between rulers and commanders. Orders lost relevance by the time they were delivered. Alliances strained under silence. Winter expanded distance without changing geography, isolating regions from central control. This fragmentation shaped medieval governance, reinforcing local autonomy and limiting centralized power. Winter did not overthrow rulers directly, but it constrained their reach, redefining the practical limits of rule. The cold also influenced morale in subtle ways. Soldiers measured success not only by victories, but by survival through winter. An army that endured cold intact gained confidence and cohesion, while one that suffered losses without fighting felt defeated before battle. Desertion increased as winter hardships mounted, with men slipping away to seek shelter and food elsewhere. Loyalty weakened when survival outweighed obligation. Winter tested not just logistics, but the social bonds holding armies together. Historical memory preserved these lessons. Chronicles often describe campaigns undone by cold, emphasizing weather as the decisive factor rather than enemy strength. Leaders were praised or condemned based on their handling of winter, their ability to retreat in time or secure shelter. These accounts reinforced a collective understanding that nature could overrule ambition. Military success required respect for seasonal limits, patience, and restraint. Winter rewarded caution and punished overconfidence with quiet finality. In many cases, cold decided outcomes without spectacle. Armies withdrew, sieges collapsed, and plans dissolved, leaving no battlefield to commemorate. Victory belonged to those who endured rather than advanced. Borders shifted not because of conquest, but because winter prevented resistance or forced retreat. The absence of battle did not diminish winter's impact, it amplified it. Power changed hands through attrition rather than clash. Winter's influence on war and travel reveals a medieval world governed as much by environment as by intention. Strategy was inseparable from season, and success depended on alignment with forces beyond human control. Cold did not favor sides or ideologies. It enforced limits universally, shaping history through constraint rather than confrontation. In the medieval era, many wars were decided not by who fought better, but by who survived winter long enough to fight at all. Every corner of the landscape, its consequences followed the lines of wealth, status, and power with relentless precision. The season functioned as a quiet examiner of social position, revealing who possessed the means to endure hardship and who lived perpetually on the edge of collapse. Survival in winter was not merely a matter of strength or preparation, but of access. The colder the months grew, the more visible inequality became, etched into bodies, homes, and outcomes. For the nobility, winter was an inconvenience rather than a threat. Stone castles and manor houses, though often drafty, provided shelter far superior to peasant dwellings. Thick walls retained heat, fireplaces burned steadily, and servants ensured that fuel and food were available throughout the season. Cellars stored grain, salted meat, wine, and ale in quantities unimaginable to the rural poor. Even when winters were harsh, nobles endured them with relative security. Hunger rarely reached their tables, and illness, though present, was mitigated by warmth, rest, and access to care. Winter tested comfort, not survival. Peasant life offered no such buffer. Most rural families lived in small wooden or wattle-and daub houses with minimal insulation. Roofs leaked, floors were earthen, and smoke from indoor fires lingered heavily in confined spaces. Heating depended on scarce firewood, carefully rationed because forests were controlled by lords and access restricted. As winter progressed, homes grew colder and darker, forcing families to cluster together for warmth. Animals were sometimes brought indoors, sharing space out of necessity rather than choice. These conditions increased illness and discomfort, making daily existence itself a form of endurance. Food inequality sharpened during winter months. Peasants relied on their own harvests and modest stores, which were often insufficient even in good years. Rents, tithes, and obligations to landlords reduced what could be kept for personal survival. By midwinter, many families faced difficult choices: reduce meals, slaughter breeding animals, or consume seed grain meant for spring planting. Each option carried consequences that extended beyond the season. Hunger struck earlier and deeper among the poor, eroding strength and resistance long before it threatened the wealthy. The elderly suffered disproportionately in this landscape of scarcity. Aging bodies struggled to retain heat and required consistent nourishment that winter rarely provided. Older peasants often depended on family support, yet when resources were scarce, care became strained. Those without strong kin networks faced isolation and neglect, not from cruelty, but from necessity. Winter mortality among the elderly was high, accepted as tragic but inevitable. Their deaths rarely disrupted social order, reinforcing the perception that winter claimed those already near life's margins. Children, too, bore unequal burdens. In wealthy households, children were protected by better clothing, nutrition, and shelter. Among the poor, childhood was fragile, especially in winter. Small bodies lost heat quickly, and illness spread rapidly in overcrowded homes. Malnutrition stunted growth and weakened immune systems, leaving lasting effects even on those who survived. Winter thus shaped future generations unevenly, reproducing inequality through health and survival rates that favored the privileged. Urban poverty reflected similar patterns. Towns concentrated wealth and opportunity, but also deprivation. Artisans and laborers lived close to subsistence, dependent on steady work that winter often interrupted. Construction slowed, trade declined, and wages fell just as food prices rose. Wealthy merchants could absorb these fluctuations, while the poor spiraled quickly into debt or hunger. Charity existed through churches and guilds, but it was limited and often overwhelmed during prolonged winters. Urban winter survival depended as much on social networks as on income. Clothing further marked class divisions. Warm garments required wool, fur, and skilled labor, making them expensive. Nobles and clergy wore layered clothing, lined cloaks, and fur-trimmed robes that insulated effectively against cold. Peasants relied on coarse fabrics, patched and reused until threadbare. Shoes wore thin, exposing feet to frost and injury. Clothing was not merely protection, it was a visible indicator of who could afford warmth. Winter transformed attire into a matter of life expectancy. Even access to fuel revealed inequality. Firewood was essential for heating and cooking, yet controlled by landowners. Peasants faced strict penalties for gathering wood without permission. As winter deepened, desperation grew, and theft increased, bringing punishment that compounded suffering. Nobles, by contrast, burned wood freely, sometimes extravagantly. Warmth became a privilege enforced by law as well as wealth. Winter thus reinforced power structures through control of basic survival resources. Healthcare mirrored these divisions. While medical knowledge was limited across classes, access differed significantly. Nobles consulted physicians, monks, or skilled healers, while the poor relied on folk remedies and prayer. Illness that might be survivable with rest and nourishment became fatal when combined with cold and hunger. Winter amplified these disparities, ensuring that disease followed predictable social patterns. Mortality was never random, it was socially distributed. Winter also shaped moral judgment. Survival was often interpreted as evidence of virtue or divine favor, while suffering was framed as misfortune or failure. This belief reinforced existing hierarchies, allowing inequality to appear natural rather than constructed. Those who endured winter comfortably were seen as deserving their status, while those who perished were absorbed quietly into the background of seasonal hardship. Winter killed without accusation, leaving social structures intact. Over time, repeated winters ingrained these divisions deeply. Communities learned who would endure and who was most at risk. Expectations adjusted accordingly. The poor planned for loss, while the wealthy planned for continuity. Winter became a predictable filter through which society passed each year, thinning the vulnerable and stabilizing the powerful. Its judgment was silent, unrecorded in law, yet consistently enforced. In the medieval world, winter did not create inequality, but it exposed it with ruthless clarity. Cold stripped away illusion, revealing survival as a function of access rather than effort alone. Who lived through winter, and who did not, followed patterns as old as the social order itself. Winter asked no questions and offered no mercy. It simply revealed, year after year, where each person stood in the hierarchy of endurance. Winter in the medieval imagination was never a neutral phenomenon. It carried meaning far beyond cold and darkness, occupying a central place in how people understood suffering, order, and their relationship with the divine. In a world where natural forces lay beyond human control, winter demanded interpretation. It was not enough to endure it, it had to be explained. Religion provided the framework through which cold seasons were understood, transforming environmental hardship into moral and spiritual experience. Medieval Christianity taught that the world operated according to divine will. Nothing occurred without purpose, and no suffering was meaningless. Winter, with its hunger, illness, and death, was therefore read as a message rather than a coincidence. A harsh season could signify punishment for collective sin, a call to repentance, or a test of faith imposed to strengthen the soul. These interpretations did not lessen physical pain, but they offered structure to fear. Cold became intelligible when placed within a moral universe governed by God. Scripture reinforced this worldview. Biblical narratives were filled with trials, famines, and periods of deprivation sent to correct or refine humanity. Medieval sermons drew heavily on these examples, connecting present suffering to sacred history. Winter was likened to spiritual barrenness, a time when faith was tested in the absence of comfort. Just as the land lay dormant, so too were believers urged to reflect, repent, and prepare for renewal. The cycle of seasons mirrored the cycle of sin, repentance, and redemption. Prayer intensified as winter deepened. Communities gathered to ask for mild weather, sufficient food, and protection from illness. Special processions were held during prolonged cold or famine, with clergy leading villagers through fields and streets, invoking divine mercy. Saints associated with protection, healing, or weather were called upon repeatedly. These rituals served both spiritual and social functions, reinforcing unity in the face of shared hardship. Collective prayer transformed private fear into communal endurance. Fasting, already central to medieval religious practice, took on additional significance in winter. Scarcity aligned naturally with spiritual discipline, blurring the line between voluntary abstinence and enforced hunger. The faithful were encouraged to see deprivation as an opportunity for moral purification rather than mere misfortune. While this framing could comfort some, it also normalized suffering, making hardship an expected and even necessary part of spiritual life. Winter thus reinforced the idea that endurance itself was virtuous. Symbolism saturated medieval interpretations of cold. Winter represented death, judgment, and the fragility of earthly life. Darkness symbolized sin and ignorance, while cold stood for spiritual distance from divine warmth. Yet winter was never purely negative. It also embodied order and inevitability, a reminder that God governed time as well as fate. Just as winter always returned, so too did divine law remain constant. This dual symbolism allowed people to fear winter while accepting it as part of a greater design. Fear played a powerful role in these interpretations. Sudden freezes, failed harvests, or prolonged storms could provoke anxiety bordering on panic. Without scientific explanations, unusual weather was often read as a warning. Comets, eclipses, and severe winters were linked in the popular imagination as signs of impending judgment. Preachers warned congregations that moral decay invited divine correction through nature. Winter thus became a mirror reflecting collective conscience, amplifying guilt and uncertainty alongside cold. This moral reading of winter shaped how suffering was distributed and understood. Those who endured hardship quietly were praised for patience and humility. Those who complained or rebelled risked being seen as lacking faith. Poverty and illness, intensified by winter, were often framed as trials assigned by God rather than injustices to be corrected. Charity existed, but it operated within a worldview that emphasized acceptance as much as relief. Winter suffering became spiritually meaningful, even when socially destructive. Monastic life embodied this interpretation most clearly. Monasteries followed strict routines that aligned spiritual discipline with seasonal hardship. Cold cells, limited food, and long hours of prayer during winter were embraced as paths to holiness. Monks recorded winters as spiritual tests, measuring devotion by endurance. These accounts influenced broader culture, presenting winter hardship as an opportunity for moral elevation. The idealization of suffering filtered outward, shaping how lay communities interpreted their own pain. Yet faith did not erase fear. People prayed precisely because they were afraid. Illness, hunger, and death were not abstract concepts but constant possibilities intensified by winter. Religious explanation offered meaning, but not certainty. Prayers were sometimes unanswered, winters sometimes unrelenting. When suffering persisted despite devotion, interpretations shifted. Hardship could be reframed as collective failure, divine mystery, or preparation for reward beyond earthly life. Faith adapted, absorbing disappointment without abandoning belief. Over time, these interpretations became deeply ingrained. Children learned to associate winter with spiritual reflection and moral vigilance. Stories, hymns, and visual art reinforced the symbolism of cold and darkness as part of the human condition. Even joy, when it came, was framed against winter's backdrop. Spring's arrival carried spiritual significance precisely because winter had preceded it. Renewal meant more when deprivation had been endured. Winter thus shaped medieval faith as much as faith shaped responses to winter. Cold seasons structured religious calendars, intensified rituals, and reinforced moral narratives that explained suffering without resolving it. By interpreting winter as punishment, testing, or divine order, medieval society transformed environmental hardship into spiritual experience. Fear was never eliminated, but it was given language, ritual, and meaning. In this way, winter became more than a season. It was a theological event, recurring each year with quiet authority. It reminded people of human vulnerability, divine power, and the limits of earthly control. Faith did not conquer winter, but it allowed medieval society to face it with structure rather than chaos. Cold was endured not only with fire and food, but with prayer, symbolism, and belief that suffering, however severe, existed within a purpose larger than itself. Winter never loosened its grip on the medieval world, but over centuries, people learned how to live with it rather than merely suffer through it. This change did not arrive as a single innovation or revelation. It emerged slowly, shaped by repetition, memory, and loss. Each winter left behind lessons written not in theory, but in survival. Communities adapted not because they mastered nature, but because endurance demanded adjustment. The cold remained constant, yet human responses evolved, gradually transforming winter from an uncontested force into one that could be anticipated, managed, and partially resisted. Housing reflected this long process of negotiation. Early medieval dwellings offered minimal protection against cold, built quickly from local materials and designed more for proximity to fields than insulation. Over time, experience reshaped construction. Walls grew thicker, roofs steeper to shed snow, and windows smaller to retain heat. Chimneys replaced open hearths, improving warmth and reducing smoke inhalation. Floors were raised or covered, and living spaces were reorganized to concentrate heat where it mattered most. These changes did not eliminate cold, but they reduced its reach, turning homes into shelters rather than temporary refuges. Clothing underwent similar evolution. Winter taught the value of layering, durability, and repair. Wool became central not for fashion, but for survival, prized for its ability to retain warmth even when damp. Garments were designed to be reused, altered, and passed down, embedding practicality into daily life. Fur, once a luxury, gained functional importance in colder regions. Over generations, communities learned which materials endured winter best, shaping regional styles rooted in necessity rather than preference. Clothing became a technology of endurance, quietly improving with each harsh season. Food systems adapted through caution and diversification. Repeated experience with scarcity taught communities to plan not for average winters, but for bad ones. Storage techniques improved incrementally. Granaries were raised to deter moisture and pests. Salting, smoking, and drying became more refined. Crop choices shifted toward varieties better suited to local climates, even if yields were lower. Livestock management adjusted, balancing immediate needs against long-term sustainability. These changes did not prevent famine entirely, but they reduced its frequency and severity, turning survival into a calculated risk rather than a gamble. Memory played a critical role in these adaptations. Winter was remembered vividly, especially when it brought loss. Stories of famine, frozen rivers, and mass death were passed down as warnings rather than histories. Communities marked time by notorious winters, shaping behavior long after the cold had receded. Preparation became a cultural habit, reinforced by collective memory. Excess was not wasted lightly, and caution persisted even in prosperous years. Winter taught restraint, embedding it deeply into medieval mentalities. Governance, too, evolved in response to seasonal pressure. Authorities learned that winter limited enforcement, communication, and military reach. This understanding influenced administrative rhythms. Taxes were collected after harvests, laws enforced more strictly in accessible seasons, and campaigns planned around climatic realities. Some rulers invested in infrastructure, such as improved roads, bridges, and storage facilities, to reduce winter disruption. While power remained constrained by cold, it became more flexible, adapting to environmental limits rather than colliding with them blindly. Urban centers reflected this gradual change most clearly. Towns developed systems to regulate grain supply, control prices, and distribute food during shortages. Municipal granaries and emergency measures emerged not from charity alone, but from hard-earned awareness that winter instability threatened social order. While these systems were imperfect and often favored elites, they represented a shift toward collective management of seasonal risk. Winter became a problem to be managed administratively, not solely endured individually. Religious practice adapted alongside material changes. While winter continued to carry spiritual meaning, interpretation softened over time. Hardship remained significant, but repeated experience fostered acceptance without panic. Rituals persisted, yet they coexisted with practical preparation. Faith did not disappear, but it shared space with planning. Prayer accompanied storage, and ritual aligned with readiness. This balance reflected a maturing worldview, one that saw winter as part of divine order but also as a recurring challenge requiring human response. Technological change was slow, yet cumulative. Tools improved marginally, transportation adapted cautiously, and knowledge spread unevenly. No single innovation conquered winter, but many small ones reduced its dominance. Even language shifted, reflecting familiarity rather than fear alone. Winter remained harsh, but it became predictable. Predictability allowed planning, and planning reduced vulnerability. Over time, this accumulation of small adjustments altered the balance between environment and society. Yet winter never disappeared as a threat. Even with adaptation, severe seasons continued to overwhelm preparation. Famine, disease, and social strain persisted, reminding medieval communities that control was always partial. What changed was not winter's power, but humanity's relationship to it. Blind endurance gave way to informed caution. Experience replaced surprise, and memory guided response. Survival became more than hope. It became practice. The long-term impact of this negotiation reshaped medieval society subtly but decisively. Communities grew more resilient, institutions more aware of seasonal limits, and cultures more attuned to environmental reality. Winter continued to test bodies and structures, but it no longer defined them entirely. Instead, it became one force among many, influential but no longer absolute. The medieval world did not defeat winter. It learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to live alongside it. In the end, winter's legacy was not solely one of death and hardship, but of adaptation shaped by necessity. Each cold season left traces in architecture, diet, governance, and memory. These traces accumulated, forming a quiet record of human resilience. Winter remained a silent presence, but its voice changed. It spoke less as a judge and more as a reminder of limits, preparation, and the enduring capacity of societies to adjust rather than collapse.